So there's obviously a lot going on right now following the tragic death, the killing of George Floyd at the hands of 4 police officers. And I wanted to highlight the approach to communication that I came across just by chance, kind of consuming YouTube footage about this incident. And I noticed an interview given by the Police Chief Medaria Arradondo. He is the police chief actually in charge of the 4 officers that were involved in what in my view was criminal murder. And he obviously is being asked to respond to the journalist Sara Sidner from CNN. He is speaking live. It is in the middle of protests, surrounded by journalists and camera crews who are beaming his words all around the world, directly on CNN. And in addition, as we find out, the family of George Floyd are actually on camera with the studio at that very moment. So he is having to address really the world on a very, very kind of poignant topic. And I came across it and I was surprisingly impressed by how he dealt with this situation. I thought it was a good example of crisis communication. I am not always impressed by police officers, I will admit openly. So I was actually pleasantly surprised by the way he dealt with this. And I thought I wanted to highlight it as a good example of communication skills in the midst of difficulties. So let's see what he says to the first question asked by the journalist, and then we'll kind of talk about it afterwards.
Chief, you came here to do what? We watched you walk up to this memorial. What did you come here to do today?
I came to pay my respects to Mr. Floyd, and I came to just offer prayer for his loved ones, his family, and our community that's hurting. I grew up about a block from here, and this has been so impactful for me, for this department, but for our city. But I also wanted to be in a space where people who love Mr. Floyd, I wanted to be in a space where people are talking about how do we heal and how do we move from this. And so it's going to take time, and I think that everyone here is trying to everyone here is trying to do the best that they can to offer what their feelings, and those are all valid. But I just needed to be here in this space today, and offer my respects.
Now, what do you notice about that? I'll tell you what jumped out at me is that, but for the fact that I know he's a police officer and obviously he's wearing his police uniform, you wouldn't actually have been able to tell just from listening to his words that he was a police officer, let alone the police chief responsible for these 4 officers. And I thought that was very effective because what he did immediately was personalize the situation, almost deflect from the question of the institution of the police and bring himself in as a human being. You know, he grew up a block from here. He came to see just what was going on, to pay his own respects to the George Floyd family. I thought that was very effective because obviously he's in the firing line, and what he was entitled to expect would be kind of incoming flak from everybody around him. So he knows he's going kind of into the fire. And although it looks like a very almost casual response to an important question, what I think he was doing, and in my view successfully achieving, was to set himself up as a person part of the same community that he is kind of sworn to protect, as opposed to somebody standing apart from it. And I think, in fact, that allows the interview to continue in a way that is less adversarial and more just a question of what are his views as somebody of importance on a situation that the rest of the world is watching. So I was impressed with this. Let's see how he goes on, and then I'll pick it up from there.
Let me ask you about what happened with Officer Derek Chauvin. First off, he had 18 complaints filed against him. 16 of those complaints were declined. They did not do anything to him. 2 of those complaints he did get censured. Should he have been on the force in the first place?
Now, a great question from the journalist, Sara Sidner, and I want to give her props for that because I often have an issue with journalists just asking gotcha questions, questions designed to make people uncomfortable for the sake of a great YouTube viral moment, as opposed to questions designed to get facts and information that will allow us as viewers to make our own judgments. And for me, she strikes it exactly right there. What were those officers, or that officer in particular, doing, bearing in mind the number of complaints they had? So that was a very good question. And let's see how the police officer responds.
Well, we need to absolutely look at the record of those types of complaints that officers or employees get throughout. There's all types of other things that come into play in terms of whether it's grievances and arbitrations and those things. But at the end of the day, our community members need to know that the men and women that put this badge on, that they are doing so in service to them, and they should not have to doubt. They should not have to doubt the integrity and if they're going to be treated in a compassionate and professional way. And so those are things that as we move forward, we need to get better in terms of this profession. Absolutely.
So, bit of a neutral answer. I sensed a little bit of restlessness from the surrounding crowd, almost as though they could feel like, oh, is he about to go into kind of company speak and platitudes? Now, again, as you'll see as this goes on, I think he's kind of setting things up as non-adversarial. So being quite neutral, being quite calm, being quite simple in his responses, so that it sets up what then follows. But this, for me, is the danger point. This is where most responses from leaders in this situation would go to the company line, right? You imagine that probably the PR consultants have already been at him saying, you have to say this, you have to say that in order to defend the liability of the police department and all of that. You can imagine there's probably a lot of pressure on him. So when I was watching this, I was expecting this interview to continue in that vein where he kind of offers mildly supportive responses, but not really saying much. But as you'll go on to see, I was actually pleasantly surprised by how he then dealt with things.
Can I ask you why you decided? I have not seen this happen this quickly before. In past cases, I have covered many protests around the world, including what happened in 2014 in the Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Missouri. Why did you decide that firing the officers would happen as quickly as it did? Many departments do not fire officers that fast.
So again, great question by the journalist. I'm really impressed actually with her laser focused approach to the questions that people really want to know. And this for me is where the interview actually gets interesting, because of course there is a big question as to why those officers were still on the beat, as opposed to, off it, or at least being watched properly. And now is where you want to see what kind of response you're going to get from this police chief. So let's see what his response actually is.
There are absolute truths in life. We need air to breathe. The killing of Mr. Floyd was an absolute truth that it was wrong. And so I did not need days or weeks or months or processes or bureaucracies to tell me that what occurred out here last Monday, it was wrong.
So what are the things that he's done here? So the first actually is, before this interview at all, he has already taken action. And that is particularly important in communication generally, but certainly in crisis communication. He has set this interview up so that by having taken deliberative, kind of serious action, which is that he has already dismissed the 4 officers, as he explained, without, long processes, hearings, waiting for the legal process to play itself out. He has already taken action. And that is important because, especially in crisis communication, but generally anyway, your actions speak louder than words. What you do is far louder to people than what you say. What you say can give the context, it can frame the discussion around what you've done, but what you've done is far more important. And he has set himself up by already taking action so that the words he then follows with are congruent. He's able to express himself simply, with clarity and with the force of knowing that he has already taken action to back it up. So I was particularly impressed again with his answers, primarily because of the actions that had preceded them.
Why did you fire them, though? Was this an absolute violation of guidelines and policy?
In my mind, this was a violation of humanity. This was a violation of the oath that the majority of the men and women that put this uniform on, this goes absolutely against it. This is contrary to what we believe in. And so, again, what occurred to me, it was an absolute truth that it was wrong. Period.
Do you see how he doesn't lose any platitudes? Again, in crisis communication, what you want is clarity and simplicity. And he is clear about what he stands for, which is congruent with what he did. And then he gives a very clear explanation. Really, really good approach and a good example.
The Floyd family happens to be on live with us and talking to Don Lemon. Is there anything that you would like to say to this family who is in utter despair and grief right now?
Now, this is the moment actually that I have to say really did kind of stand out to me, and you'll see in a second why. But just again, imagine the fact that he has the family of George Floyd right there in studio, at least on camera, asking a question directly to him. The eyes of the world are on him. And again, if you were tempted to see this as an opportunity to be defensive, to explain the company line, or to do all those kind of fairly typical things that, managers often do, this would have been the moment. But as we'll see, he actually takes a different approach.
I would say to the Floyd family that I'm absolutely devastatingly sorry for their loss. And if I could do anything to bring Mr. Floyd back, I would move heaven and earth to do that. So I'm very sorry.
Will you call up the National
I'm very
Guard from
sorry.
this site
Thank you
tonight?
so much. I appreciate.
Look at what he did there, right? So think about his body language. He took off his police hat. Why did he do that? Well, obviously, he wanted to kind of clear away the barriers between him and the family to the extent that he could. I suspect that if he could have taken off his mask, if we weren't in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, I suspect he would have taken off his mask there as well. And what he's trying to do is to remove all barriers between him and the people he's speaking with so that they can see and sense his sincerity. It also allows us to see his eyes a bit more, which again is very important when you're trying to connect with an audience, with individuals or a group of people. You also notice his tone. It was somber, it was serious, it was direct, and it was personal. He simply expressed his personal kind of apology, personal recognition of the terrible emotions that the family must be going through. And again, as an example of communication in the midst of difficulty, it really, really is excellent. And I think everyone around, if you notice, everyone around is absorbed with what he is saying. There is now very little protest. Everybody's listening rather than trying to jeer at him or make any other kind of complaints. They actually just want to hear what he has to say because they recognize that he is as much part of the moment as everyone else. I really thought that as an example of nailing precisely the right tone to take in the middle of a very, very, very difficult situation, that he really got it. There's one final moment I want to show you, which is when he's asked another question by the family, or at least asked a question by the family for the first time, as far as he was fully aware, in terms of them posing a question to him. So let's just find that clip.
Chief, may I ask you, I'm so sorry, and I apologize. I'm so sorry. I know, I'm so sorry, but the Floyd family actually has a question for you. They just talked to me in my ear. I'm sorry, the Floyd family is asking me a question.
Now, again, I want to give props to the journalist. Again, I love this kind of journalism. She recognized that she was interrupting another journalist. I genuinely believe she wouldn't have done it, but for the fact that she obviously knew she was in a particular moment with the Floyd family right in her ear, asking a question of the police chief, that she just had to kind of grasp the nettle, interrupt the other journalist, and pose the question back to the police chief. So again, I'm really impressed with that, which is probably why I enjoyed this clip even more than I normally do when I see stuff going on in journalism, kind of questioning senior figures that they should. So let's now see how the police chief responds.
I apologize. I'm sorry. The Floyd family has asked if you are going to get justice for George Floyd by making sure that the other officers are arrested and that eventually convicted. They want to, and I know that there are things that you cannot control, but they want to know if the other officers should be arrested in your mind, and if you see that they should all four be convicted in this case.
And this is the Floyd family right now?
This is the Floyd family.
To the Floyd family, being silent or not intervening, to me, you're complicit. So I don't see a level of distinction any different. Obviously, the charging and those decisions will have to come through our county attorney's office. Certainly the FBI is investigating that. But to the Floyd family, I want you to know that my decision to fire all four officers was not based on some sort of hierarchy. Mr. Floyd died in our hands, and so I see that as being complicit. So that is about as much as, and I apologize to the Floyd family if I am not more clear, but I don't see a difference in terms of the ultimate outcome is he is not here with us.
And you don't see a difference between what Officer Chauvin did and the three other officers who, some of who kneeled down as well, but some of whom just watched. You see that all as the same act.
Silence and inaction, you're complicit. You're complicit. If there were one solitary voice that would have intervened and act, that's what I would have hoped for. Unfortunately,
that's what you would have expected from your officers, yes?
Absolutely, and that did not occur. So to the Floyd family, I hope that's my response. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much.
And again, do you see how took off his hat to show respect to the family, spoke sincerely, spoke really from the heart is the impression that I got from that, and spoke his truth, silence his complicity. That was clearly the message that he wanted to give in that moment. And again, I thought it was just a really positive, strong example of how to communicate in a crisis, get your point across, kind of deflate any antagonism that you might face in a way that establishes your humanity so that people can hear the message that you are actually trying to impart. I know that he will face a lot of questions, both for what he has done before the incident and what he did afterwards. But for that single moment, in terms of how to deal with difficult questions in a difficult situation, I want to give my hats off and props to Police Chief Medaria Arradondo. Impressed with you, sir. Well done.